I'm very delighted to welcome our keynote for today, Deborah Levitt, Assistant Professor of Culture and Media Studies at the New School in New York. Professor Levitt researches how media, old and new, transform both everyday experience and expanded global political spheres across film, post-cinema, animation, literature, cultural theory, and science and technology studies. She's the author of 2018's The Animatic Apparatus, Animation, Vitality, and the Futures of the Image, which sadly my print copy is still locked in my office, probably gathering cobwebs at McGill, but which is a wonderful book, which demonstrated how the ascendance of animation and simulation shift the concept of life in contemporary culture and call on us to rethink central concepts of ethics in response to these changes. Her current project, Rendering Worlds, investigates how understanding lives as media forms and media as life forms opens a way to address the actual state of emergency today, how to enable pluralism and promote ecological regeneration in the era of planetary computing and post-truth. Her talk today is entitled The VR Event, Perceptual Infrastructures and Worldly Sensibilities. So welcome, Deb.
Thank you so much, Alana, and thanks to Philippe and Carl and all of you who made this possible. Sorry, just getting myself set up here. So my paper is called The VR Event, Perceptual Infrastructures and Worldly Sensibilities. Before I talk about immersion in relation to VR, whose very raison d'etre is immersion, or maybe presence, as I'll talk about later. I want to think first about a different kind of immersion. And that's media ecological immersion. So even going back to Marshall McLuhan, you'll probably remember how he, I think, brings up the Aristotle line about how a fish in water couldn't perceive wetness. And he uses that as a way to emblematize the conundrum that all of us face living in a mediated environment, which is we're so inside it, we're so immersed in it, and that presents both like possibilities for exploration and experimentation, but it also really poses a question about what perception is in the context of immersion and how it functions. The question I'd like to suggest is coming into a particular kind of focus in the contemporary context as the dovetailing of globalization and an explosion of computational capacities have rendered media planetary on the one hand, and molecular or even nanotechnical on the other. We're fascinated and fearful at once in the face of what feels like an increasing decoupling of scales from a human reference point. there's a whole sort of panoply of digital action effects aesthetics that are devoted to questions of scale and movement between scales, which can be exhilarating or terrifying. But what I'm really looking for, and the reason I want to contextualize this in relation to what I'm calling ecological immersion, is because one of the kind of main issues for media studies today is trying to understand changes in the forms and capabilities of human perception in relation to computational media. So, if you think about Facebook, there's what you see on the screen, the images, the text, the videos. But then what's going on behind the scenes isn't just occluded in the way that edits in cinema are by the operations of suture, but it's actually invisible, right? Like the temporality and the spatial operations of computation are, as so many media theorists like to tell the story anyway, now not available to perceptual access. So what I'm kind of looking for here is a way to address this condition, which people like Mark Hansen and Shane Denson have referred to as the post-perceptual image, but maybe in a different, I don't know, what I'm interested in doing that I haven't been able to formulate yet is how to think about this problem of perception without thinking it from the fracture, from this moment of rupture or break where, okay, human beings were connected in a kind of known way to their perceptions of media, and now everything feels very unknown, in the sense that, you know that behind the scenes, Facebook is mining your data and tracking you and parameterizing different data sets depending on what they're looking for. But you only sense that sort of environmentally, right? Or through those boots that follow you around the internet long after you've already bought them. So there are like these clues of some kind of split between the audio-visual layer and the computational layer. Now, I don't think we can talk about post-perception necessarily, because we are continuing to perceive, we continue to perceive images. There's nothing about perception itself which has stopped, but maybe what's changed and needs to be theorized is the relationship of perception to the image ecology as a whole, like the computational image ecology as a whole. So one thing that this quote from Michel Serre's book, The Five Senses from 1985, which I've been living with and thinking about for a long time. He says something really, to me, that's very unexpected. He says, whatever sensation may have taught us, we know nothing about it. Take a black box. To its right or after it, traveling along certain circuits, there is what we call information. The energy of things goes in, disturbances of the air, shocks and vibrations, heat, alcohol or ether, salts, photons. Information comes out, and even meaning. We do not always know where this box is located, nor how it alters what flows through it, nor which sirens, muses, or bacchantes are at work inside. It remains closed to us. However, we can say with certainty that beyond this threshold, both of ignorance and perception, energies are exchanged on their usual scale at the levels of the world, the group, and cellular biochemistry. And that on the other side of this same threshold, information appears, signals, figures, languages, meaning. Before the box, the hard. After it, the soft. We do not know sensation. We might as well say that it occupies this black box. So when I first reread that after quite a long time, I was very surprised by Serre's move of putting sensation itself inside of the black box. Because normally when we think of our relationship to data, certain kinds of data, especially algorithmic processes, the black box is always on the side of computation, right? The idea of saying, well, what makes us so sure that we transparently know sensation and perception enough to give a kind of objective inventory of its changes. So hopefully I will be able to come back to this. I keep having to move my little squares around depending on what controls I need. Oops. So now I want to talk directly about virtual reality, which is, of course, known for its immersive features. And one thing that I think is really interesting about VR in relationship to immersivity and technological innovation is that VR is a kind of outlier in today's media ecology, because while so many media experiences move toward ever greater social hypermediation, as we peer into multiple windows, respond and reply to a variety of creatures in a myriad of ways, and where notifications from various elsewheres constitute the substance of our hears, VR moves in another direction. In a VR experience, we are, at least at this point, isolated from distraction, caught up in an immersive surround whose only exit is in fact a total one. I mean, you can lift up the headset and look out, but you're either in or out. Um, and the way I've been thinking about this is that we are, in effect, kidnapped by the apparatus, or we allow ourselves to be kidnapped and give ourselves over to it. So, VR, I think I can say, has the most closely and intricately programmed and controlled relationship between the human body and the apparatus. So in a literal sense, right, in order for you to sort of have an experience in a VR experience, and I'm talking now about just about like HMD room scale VR, not about 360 video, which I think is really a different animal. But so in this scenario, what the apparatus needs to do is to be able to track your movements on one side, and then to be able to have the computing power to do real-time rendering on the other. Right, so you have sort of sensing and tracking on one side, and then the rendering and re-rendering of the VR world on the other. And I think one way to think about this or make this claim about this very tight coupling that's produced between the body and the apparatus is to say that when you have latency on a website and you're waiting for it to load, it can be really irritating. But if you're in a VR experience and there's latency and the world isn't sort of rendering in response to your body's movements, you'll get nauseated, right? Because the level at which it's sort of wired into your audio visual, but also, and maybe more importantly, kinesthetic and proprioceptive senses, those are the preconditions for the experience. You know, like I think sometimes people want to talk about VR as disembodied, that you sort of escape the world into this VR experience, when in fact, every aspect of it needs to be calibrated to the perceiving and acting body of the experiencer. So it's actually incredibly creaturely, right? We may have the theorist Roberto Diodato has these beautiful terms, heavy bodies, for thinking about sort of the massy, anatomical, creaturely body on one side, and avatar bodies or other virtual effects, and he calls those subtle bodies. But one thing VR can never get away from is its really close connection to this massy anatomical body. Um, So just to say in a nutshell how all this is working, VR combines stereoscopy, motion tracking, and mostly real-time rendering to create a surround image or world. It puts you in a world and affords you various degrees of freedom to explore and interact with it. It is produced through the integration of multiple scientific and technological knowledges and procedures, and distinguished by how strictly calibrated the interface between its hard and software and the human perceptual apparatus must be. So sorry, whoa. So I'm gonna shift a little bit here to just say that because VR experiences always entail building a world, right? There's no sort of given world for VR. There's no pro-filmic real. It sort of starts by, you know, this formal necessity to create an environment for the experiencer. Each experience creates a kind of meta discourse on what constitutes a world and what it means for our minds and bodies to inhabit it. This opens up another way for us to think about VR. VR builds theories of worlds through our experience of them. It enables us to use aspects of our perceptual system in ways that other media do not, to investigate problematics and scenarios. So one thing that I want to note about how VR functions is that it's part of a kind of global apparatus of sensing and tracking. You know, satellites circle the Earth to track weather and wind and light. The rotating image that you see on the top right is actually a biosensor. So sensors can be on your body as wearables, in your body as medically implanted devices. They might be able to be in your DNA. And the ecology of VR really is a part of this planetary ecology of tracking and sensing. And one thing that's interesting about it for that reason is we don't really have a lot of ways to sort of experiment with sensing through modes of production, right? It seems like nowadays we're more sensed than sensing when it comes to the domain of images. But VR gives us this opportunity to play around with um, tracking and sensation and the modes of bodily experience they produce in a kind of more experimental setting. So, you go from climate and weather tracking to all sorts of satellite data to medical forms of sensing and tracking to different kinds of surveillance that use tracking. And then, of course, to this push to get more and more effective and tightly wired relationships between tracking and rendering. So VR, as I mentioned before, it has this capacity that it shares with animation, or not just a capacity, but like an imperative to produce a world. And there are a lot of ideas and questions about what produces presence in that world. But one thing is that you can have a really full sense of presence without visual realism, or like with only a modicum of perceptual realism. And I think the idea that a VR experience could be indistinguishable from a, I don't know, in real life experience, or let's just say not in VR experience, it just doesn't make any sense, because in VR, you can be terrified trying to walk across a plank. I can't do it, even though I know, I'm on a level floor. But in my view, at least, no matter how photoreal it is or not, it's always a different kind of world than the real world. And that's part of what makes it useful as a site for experiments with perception and sensation in relation to world making. These are images from what I think was the first VR experience I tried, and it was from Harry Potter, Fantastic Beasts and Where to Find Them. And there you go in through a kind of shack entryway, and then you have to sort of successfully make these potions and sort of say these spells, pick where you want to go. And then you can go into these different worlds. And I'm using this as an example of the sort of weirdness of VR immersion or VR presence, because I found this to be an incredibly immersive experience, despite the fact that the unfinished boundaries of the world are revealed, right? It's not like the sort of, oh, you go to the end of a game space and things start to disintegrate. Like the boundaries are within the experience posits multiple worlds and multiple experiential worlds, and it does it sort of without this kind of fully sutured experience. So I'm talking a lot about worlds, but I haven't really defined what a world is. And I think we know, in a sense, just because we're familiar with world building in fantasy and science fiction literature, in film, especially big CGI blockbusters or animations. But how does a world work? You know, what makes a world? And to think about what makes a world, I turn to the work of the theoretical biologist and cognitive scientist Francisco Varela. He was a really interesting, like his intellectual biography is super interesting because he worked between so many countries and so many disciplines, so many different milieu. I mean, I think his sort of life or work life is this experience of moving through multiple worlds. And he also gives us a really interesting and useful account of what a world is. So for Varela, a world emerges, and he talks about this in relationship both to the world of an organism, like how an organism comes into being, and also a world of the what he calls neurocognitive identity, or like the development of a kind of self sense. So what he says is that an organism and a world emerge through a transductive relationship where there are structural couplings between the body and the world, which happen at visceral and sensory motor levels, But then what really makes a world is that the organism or the self produces from these structural couplings, which are distributed and below the threshold of consciousness. But the organism or the self, in order to make a world, has to work with what Varela calls surplus signification. So basically, Varela doesn't think that consciousness or cognition are the drivers of world building, or even the drivers of subjectivity or subject formation or self-formation. He argues that from all of these distributed relations between a particular kind of body and an environment, the organism, let's just say, sort of excretes this surplus signification, which enables it to embrace the world from its own side. So it's as if, rather than consciousness being the guide for our actions, consciousness is an epiphenomenon, an excrescence, maybe even the sort of accursed share of all of these processes of structural couplings that allows organisms and selves to move through the world. You can definitely compare Varela's notion of world to von Uexküll's notion of the Umwelt. So, you know, do you all remember like the famous story of the tick that von Uexküll tells? So where he's talking about how the tick's world is formed, right? And the tick doesn't interact with its world in its entirety. He only interacts, he, she, it, I don't know, they only interact with those aspects of the world that they need to survive, right? So the tick knows to jump onto a mammal when it smells butyric acid, and it can sense temperature. And when it falls on something warm-blooded, its sense of temperature will allow it, call on it to sort of burrow and find its nourishment on blood. But the Umwelt, like, even if we lived in the same environment as this tick, we still wouldn't live in the same world. Because our perceptual apparatuses are different, and because environment and world are not the same thing for Varela, right? Like environment would be, say, the spatial ecology and its affordances and constraints that an animal finds itself in, whereas its world would be the way it generates a conception of itself as an organism in relation to its body and environment. So I don't think I put this quote, did I? No. So interestingly, Varela uses VR as an example. I know that in at least one place he talks about it was from a talk that he did maybe in the late 80s. So I'm not sure whose lab he would have been in or where he would have tried it, but because his work connected so closely with, I mean, he was really one of the inaugurators of artificial life, you know, which is another way to think about artificial intelligence. So not too surprising that he would have been in these like media computational milieu. But so what he says about his experience in VR is, and I'm quoting now, another dramatic example of this surplus significance and the dazzling performance of the brain as the generator of neural narratives is provided by the technologies of the virtual realities. What is most significant for me here is the veracity of the world which rapidly springs forth. We inhabit a body within this new world after a short time of trying this new situation, i.e. 15 minutes or so. And the experience is of truly flying through walls or of delving into fractal universes. This is so in spite of the poor quality of the image, the low sensitivity of the sensors, and the limited amount of interlinking between sensory and image surfaces through a program that runs in a personal computer. So he's really using it as here, not so much to think about VR and what it is, but he's using VR as a way of explaining to us the contingencies and the plasticity of both worlds and selves, right? No world is necessary. It can always be transformed by, let's say, a different environment and different kind of structural couplings. So Varela really stresses this in another work that he co-authored, or in the introduction, called the book is called The Embodied Mind. And he and his co-authors write, we emphasize the growing conviction that cognition is not the representation of a pre-given world by a pre-given mind, but is rather the enactment of a world and a mind on the basis of a history of the variety of actions that a being in the world performs, right? So there's no world that precedes the very plastic possibilities of structural couplings and surplus signification. And the surplus signification, right, it emerges at the threshold between sensation as physical interactions between sensory motor actions and sense as world making, or to use different terms, as embodying these sensory and mechanical performances in an image schema. The organism's environment may be given, but its world emerges through the manner in which it signifies this environment to itself based on the potentials and constraints offered by the specificities of its particular nervous system and its interactions with the environment. The cognitive agent emerges, as does consciousness itself, as an epiphenomenon of distributed sensory motor couplings and routines. So I'm gonna go on pretty shortly to look at some works, some VR experiences, and talk about what they do and the kind of worlds I think they make. But I do want to make one point about a shortcoming of Varela's, or just like maybe a blind spot or something he doesn't attend to, which is because he's so focused on the synchronic emergence of the self or of a world, he doesn't really think about the field of pre-personal singularities, right? And social relations that bubbles up to create another set of conditions of possibilities and constraints for world making. John Pratevi is someone, I mean, he works on VR, but he's really focused on, similar to Varela, the relationship between the social and somatic as they operate outside of consciousness. And he's really looking at where the social is a factor of pre-formation of the subject, the organism, the individual, the world. So I'm really, I mean, mostly I've been looking at artists' VR, and I'm especially interested in projects that really explicitly experiment with putting the affordances of weird embodiment in VR into the service of trying to think through how we can understand our world and our contemporary media ecology at a time when so many scales and operations seem to be beyond the ken um, of human perception and sensation. So um, one experience that works with this in a really interesting way was created by Hyphen Labs, which is an international collective of women designers. Um, and it's part of a larger project, which includes an installation with different objects that you might need um, to sort of repel um, racializing violence of surveillance and of prohibition. The project as a whole that the VR experience is a part of is really trying to think through the exclusion of women and people of color generally when developers are creating hardware that enables particular kinds of experiences, right? So if you have a small head, the HTC Vive is like insanely heavy. Um, if you have a lot of hair, then you have another issue with putting the headset on. Basically the sort of default is to design it for a sort of average, normal white male subject. Um, so they're coming into the project with this idea of opening a space for women of color in the sort of imaginary formations and potentials of technoculture. Um, so neurospeculative Afrofeminism is about um, the experience of transcranial direct stimulation. So when you put the headset on, it's like you're looking in a mirror and your avatar is a Black woman and you're in this kind of part beauty salon, part neuroimaging lab. Um, and in order to put the sensors on you, um, which they call Octavia Electrodes, like of course after Octavia Butler, um, they braid them into your hair. So they take this very culturally specific and significant locale of a hair braiding salon um, and open it onto both this like sort of neuroscientific imaging lab and then to the experience that having the TCDS is supposed to engender, right? Which is an experience of mind, sort of mind expansion. It's a kind of trip. So I'll show you, it's always hard to talk about VR because you can never actually really show folks what's going on in an experience without putting them in it. And really, I don't know what's going to happen to VR with COVID, because certainly like lines of people aren't going to be putting on the same headset. So I don't know. I don't know what its future is. Oops, in that sense. So I'll just play you the little teaser video for neurospeculative Afrofeminism, so you can get a sense of what it's like. Hmm. So one thing that you can see about the piece just from this little video trailer is the extent to which it's preoccupied with scale and movement between scales. You know, so it starts in this very particular local space, and then the Octavia Electrodes um, open the, I don't know whether to say user, experiencer, player, spectator, to having this sort of vertiginous, but at the same time, like sort of smooth, floating, gliding experience of this enormous Afrofuturist themed outer space. Um, and so I think that, and Hyphen Labs is really connecting in various ways through the piece traditions of storytelling and record keeping that are traditional to African and Afro-diasporic people, and sort of making that or bringing that into conversation with the sort of mind-blowing potentials of these new neurotechnologies. So this is my last example, and I'm going to speak. I'm going to tell you a little bit about a piece by the Dutch-born, New York-based artist Jacob Kudsk-Steensen. And so for some of the artists and creative technologists who work in VR, it becomes a lab for the research creation of worlds, a site for the speculative design of embodiment and sociality. Steensen is a cosmotechnologist whose VR experiences engaging ecological themes teach us not about the Anthropocene or about media techniques, but instead conjure new experiences of how to live in and navigate a world whose profound threats to many forms of life remain in many ways unthinkable. In Tyrannic Animism, for example, Stevenson thinks digital animation as a form of animism, that's actually a quote, that connects human experience to landscapes that shift back and forth between scenes and elements in nature, and as images captured by and accessible through visual and sensory technologies. So he's not creating a virtual reality of a pure nature, but rather worlds in which humans navigate nature cultures through media techniques. But neither are techniques pure or abstract in Stevenson's work. They are embedded in various mythical dimensions of cosmotechnical second natures, from shamanism to psychoanalysis. Stevenson creates experiences that layer the far-flung arrhythmics, times, spaces, and scales of the Anthropocene around avatar embodiment, making them available to experience, although not necessarily conscious experience. He describes his intention as, quote, to produce new forms of ecological awareness, unquote. But he's doing more than this as well. And I'll show you a clip, but I will talk over it. Oops. Well, maybe this is not going to work. So I'll describe it to you instead, even though that's much less fun. Aquaphobia, which was a piece that he did in 2017, layers the voiceover narrative of a relationship from the perspective of its end, its breakup, onto the user's movement through a series of interlocking interior and exterior spaces and elements. The user navigates through these spaces as an explorer, not sure where they lead. The trajectory of exploration takes you from an underground room with panels that display and open and close onto other kinds of spaces. It's part cave, part natural history museum, complete with vitrines. The experience, built from footage captured at a park in Red Hook, Brooklyn, takes you through crumbling, muddy tunnels and out through a stand of cattails to gaze over the water. You follow an undulating blob of water, or it follows you. And in the end of the experience, you look through a kind of gate and over a passageway to the ocean, and are then returned or respawned in the subterranean interior. The water blob, which gurgles and breathes, is my favorite element. You walk into it, it streams through you, and in your avatar embodiment, you feel it flow through your molecules. You don't become the water. It traverses you and you traverse it. There's an experiential connection and becoming, certainly, but you're never seeing through the eyes of another or walking in another creature's shoes, contra the rhetoric of VR as an empathy machine. There is, for me, always a strange, pleasurable shock at the contact of something moving through you. It happens once more. As I sit in the cattails, a buck surprises, dashing forward and then unexpectedly backward and through my body. In commercial VR and in video games as well, these molecular flow-throughs might appear as glitches, as disruptions in the proper flow of the experience and the proper boundaries of the avatar body. I wouldn't refer to their appearance in Steenson's work as glitch aesthetics, however, but rather as an experiential enunciation of real conditions of experience, right? And these are the real conditions of experience generated by the proliferating scales and temporalities of computational media in the Anthropocene. Like Terratic animism, aquaphobia explores nature through foregrounding its apparatuses of capture and vice versa. One of the things that fascinates me most about Steenson's work is the way it enfolds interiority and exteriority, turning them inside out, creating a kind of Mobius strip or chiasmus. An exterior space is inside, interior space is outside, and it extends or cycles indefinitely, perhaps infinitely, turtles all the way down. Aquaphobia produces a complex composed of different scales that don't mesh, fractalize, or zoom seamlessly, but rather overlap in a convivial, if sometimes dark or alien, techno-aesthetic conversation. It's a version of ecological existence, including biosphere, atmosphere, technosphere, sociosphere, psychosphere, and so on, traversed by the avatar body or the user or just you as a force of animation. Unlike many other kinds of representations of the scalar conundrums of the Anthropocene, you're very much in it. There is nothing that is so big or so small that it doesn't cross your path as a quality of experience. The scales intersect your body, though it is not quite clear who you are. It's not engaged in a politics of visibility in regard to environmental dangers, but rather in something more like an ethics and politics of worldly cosmotechnical sensibility. So I'll stop there.